Everyone knows about Peter Parker Spider-Man at this point, given the latter is up there with the most recognizable superhero characters of all time, and also given how relatable, endearing, and enduring Peter is, even when he's not specifically using his spider powers. Most Spider-Man movies will focus on something to do with growing up, given Parker gets bitten by a spider when he's a teenager, and then has to contend with all these wild and unusual things happening to him while he's trying to navigate an already tricky world. High school. Peter grows up, falls in love, loses people close to him, and tries to stay afloat. All things that regular people do as they themselves grow and come of age. But Peter has to fight off a bunch of criminals, creatures, and sworn enemies while he does it. The basic premise of Spider-Man might then be simple, but the things that can be done with the character add considerable layers. Further complicating things is the fact that there are different versions of Spider-Man or Spider-People, best exemplified by the ongoing Spider-Verse series, where the most prominent Spider-Man there wasn't even called Peter Parker. Instead, he was Miles Morales. One branch of Spider-Man that didn't last too long was the one defined by Andrew Garfield's time in the lead role. Following 3 Sam Raimi-directed movies, Spider-Man was rebooted rather hastily, and Garfield got 2 solo movies to his name. The failure of the second seemingly standing in the way of things, becoming a trilogy. Yet a certain 2021 release did bring back numerous Spider-Man-related characters into one story, Garfield's Peter Parker included, and so now, the actor has appeared in 3 Spider-Man movies. The bunch of them are ranked below, starting with the not-so-good and ending with the pretty great. The Amazing Spider-Man 2. There's no nice way to say it. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is an absolute mess of a film that feels as disparate as it does desperate. It does admittedly acknowledge a critique its predecessor faced. This one, narratively, does not tread too closely to a Spider-Man story people might already be familiar with. What it does, instead, is borrow from countless sources, whirring them all into a smoothie that's hardly edible at the end of the day. Do you want too many villains, too many side characters, too many setups for sequels that'll probably never happen, and too much inconsistency when it comes to tone? You've got all those things in spades in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and the fact things were kind of called off on this whole side of Sony's Spider-Man thing after its release was, in hindsight, probably merciful. It's not really Garfield's fault here, and his co-star, Emma Stone, does about all she can with the material at hand. But boy, is that material pretty awful. It's also a film defined by the mess it makes. Across the space of almost 2.5 hours, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 clumsily dips its toes into whatever genre it pleases, breaking such genres apart and throwing all the debris around with nary a care for where such pieces land, not caring what new formations might take shape. It builds and builds in this unwieldy way, and then collapses on itself with spectacle. And a few short scenes near the end can only tease a cleanup process of sorts that never comes. Whether The Amazing Spider-Man 2 stays a cautionary tale or ends up being a Caligula or Southland Tales-esque cult classic in decades to come remains to be seen. The Amazing Spider-Man. Of all the Spider-Man movies starring Andrew Garfield, it feels the most difficult to come up with things to say about The Amazing Spider-Man. This 2012 film cannot count itself among the worst superhero movies of all time by any means, but by that same token, it's a long way off being up there as an all-time great superhero film. It exists to be merely more Spider-Man, for better or worse. The Raimi trilogy was over, with Spider-Man 3 a still relatively recent memory. Boldly, those behind The Amazing Spider-Man went back only another 5 years, retelling a very similar origin story that had just been told 10 years earlier, in 2002's classic Spider-Man. Sure, the teenagers this time around look a little younger, but all the familiar beats are hit with just a bit too much familiarity. Peter might have a different foe and a love interest with different hair this time around, but the circumstances of him becoming Spider-Man are quite familiar. As is the fact that good old Uncle Ben proves to be as doomed as ever. The Amazing Spider-Man is well made, but it's a déjà vu heavy kind of film in a way that feels shockingly blatant. The message here seems to be that Sony knows you won't have forgotten the broad strokes of that one very famous film from 2002, and that they're just going to give you something very similar again. Because why not? They're saying, line up and eat the slop. And hey, it's decent slop. It wasn't slop the first time around. It was a proper meal. But this slop substitute is pretty edible. To call it a movie again instead of a food, it's decently edible. It just could and should have been something more, though not more in the way that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was more. Truly. These two films represent one of the least well-balanced duologies, almost trilogies, in cinema history. Spider-Man: No Way Home. A redemptive film in many ways, Spider-Man. No Way Home was designed to be the third solo Spider-Man movie starring Tom Holland. Sure. But it was also intended to bring some closure to the versions of Spider-Man played by both Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. The former probably needed it a little less, given at least two of his Spider-Man movies were great, and only one was divisive. Garfield really needed a win, though, considering The Amazing Spider-Man was solid in a disappointing bland way, and The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was a mess. But he was always a good Peter Parker Spider-Man who deserved better, and better he got here, with No Way Home, proving to be a key supporting character and a scene stealer. Alongside fellow Spider-Man Tobey Maguire, and thanks to some universe-jumping chaos happening in the movie's story. Though it's a bit messy and convoluted, Spider-Man: No Way Home is a good deal of fun, and an understandably beloved celebration of Spider-Man, as he's existed on the big screen for the past 20 or so years. Watching Maguire, Garfield, and Holland come together to both fight and talk out their personal traumas is emotionally rewarding stuff. As is the Garfield-specific moment when he manages another universe's MJ, much in the way he came so close to saving his own Gwen Stacy. So, sure, No Way Home isn't exactly Garfield's movie, but he's one of the very best parts of the whole thing, and it showcases how good he is in this role better than any of his solo movies did. If one movie can be pointed to as an example of why we should get a little more Andrew Garfield on screen as Peter Parker and Spider-Man, it's Spider-Man: No Way Home.